1 in 10,000 children are born with a brain malformation known as Dandy-Walker syndrome. Dandy-Walker can cause enlargement of the skull, lack of muscle control, and other developmental challenges. More research is needed, but we do know that early therapy helps many live healthier, fuller lives. 1 in 10,000 may not seem like a lot unless your child is the one. Learn more, find help, and help others. Visit dandy-walker.org.
Hello, everybody. Welcome into another edition of Train Talks here on Big Train TV. This episode, as every episode is brought to you by the Dandy Walker Alliance. Visit dandy-walker.org to learn more today. Today, we are so happy to be joined by Big Train intern in 2017 and writer for the Commercial Dispatch in Starksville, Mississippi, Ben Portnoy. Ben, how you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me. This is fun. I love doing anything Big Train, so this is always a good time.
Well, we love having Big Train alumni on, especially those as accomplished as you are as a writer. Ben was a writer for the Big Train back in 2017. They had a great season that year, ended up winning their Cal Ripken League championship, and finished that season ranked as the number 4 team in the country. So he's got some experience covering some good baseball teams in the DMV, not to mention he had to stop covering the AllStar Game the very next summer. So again, Ben and DC baseball is certainly a strong connection. Ben, I want to kind of take us down memory lane and have you start out by telling us, when did you really decide that you wanted to get into sports journalism? And then, you know, everybody kind of decides early on, I'm saying this from experience, at least you might have a different story, that at first you want to be the guy on TV, and then maybe eventually you would turn out, it's like, well, I want to become more of a writer. So first, when did you want to get into sports journalism, or you knew you wanted to get into it? And then when did you decide, I want to be on the writing side of it?
Yeah, so mine started probably about my sophomore year of high school. I'd always been interested in sports writing. You know, I grew up every morning from the time I was about 6-7 years old, could, actually formulate real sentences. I would read the Washington Post sports page, whether that was just for box scores or actual stories, as I got a little older as well. That said, I always grew up being a lacrosse player. I really wanted to play college lacrosse. That's kind of what I wanted to do. I was lucky to play at Indiana for 2 years, but when I realized that wasn't going to take me too far beyond graduation or anything like that, I did start getting into some writing. I wrote for the high school that I went to after I moved from DC, had a sophomore newspaper that I could write for, and the place that had an opening, and I guess the place that I wanted to write for, was the sports section. So I got to edit for a few sports sections, ended up writing for the main school paper, and was editor-in-chief my senior year, and also did some freelance stuff for a high school sports website in the area. And then went to college, went to Indiana, and got to work for the school paper, and all that kind of goes into that. But no, my first year in Indiana was interesting because I definitely looked into broadcasting a little more. It was something that was newly available to me. It was something I'd never done before. And I thought that, frankly, that was where I wanted to pivot to. I thought it was something that was really cool and really different to what I had done, at least in high school. So I started out mostly as a broadcaster. Pretty much my entire freshman year was spent doing broadcasting things. The first thing I ever broadcasting was a wrestling meet. And I can tell you for sure, I pretty much couldn't tell you what was going on most of the time. That was a tough sell, but I really enjoyed the broadcasting stuff, but my sophomore year, I got started writing for the school paper. I covered the men's and women's swimming and diving team. So I was basically covering 2 teams at once. It was right after the Rio Olympics. So there were about, I think, 6 or 7 or 8 Olympians on the team. A couple of the coaches at Indiana had coached for Team USA as well. So it was a really, really fun time to cover that team. And I really loved it. And that was kind of when I realized, I was like, okay, I think this is kind of where I wanted to be geared, wanted to be doing. Did that, and that I would say that's probably when I really figured out, like, this is the writing, this is what I want to do. Carried into a few internships and some other stuff that I did in Indiana, but starting with the Big Train as well there after my sophomore year. So it's been a pretty wild ride. Geez, 2017, that makes me feel old now, but it's been fun. It's been really fun.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, everybody has their own individual story as to how they kind of got there career and dream going. And that's the thing that I always like to tell people about being a sports journalist, is that you really are working your dream job usually, and it's not work at the end of the day if you end up doing something that you love. And clearly you have found that path through Indiana, so that's awesome. I mean, Indiana's a great journalism school. So what were your first impressions of going to a school like that, a Big Ten school with a lot of sports to have an opportunity to cover, and it's one of the most well-respected J schools in the country?
Yeah, I think that's the thing that I was really lucky to have. Coming out of high school, I knew I wanted to study journalism. I mean, I was pretty sure that was what I wanted to do. I pretty much just looked up journalism schools and applied, kind of down the line. That said, it was something that it was a place that there was a lot of opportunity. There was a lot of just, chances to do really good things. The biggest thing was the student paper. We had, at least when I was there were probably 15 beat writers on the staff. I mean, that's heavier staff than even most major news newspapers at this point. So, it was a place that there was a lot of opportunity. I was able to hop on a beat right away, covered swimming and diving. And like I said, I covered the men's and the women's team. I was writing twice as many stories as probably I needed to be. But, frankly, it was a really good thing. It repped out everything that I needed to do. And, being at a Big Ten school is great. There's lots of great sports, Indiana, basketball, football, the soccer team's been great. The swimming and diving program was great. The baseball team's been really good in recent years. So it was a really awesome experience. And like I said, just being at a Big Ten school like that was really, really awesome. And I was lucky to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I can absolutely understand that, when you go to a major school, like for me, it was Arizona State, you see just kind of this wealth of opportunities that you get a chance to take advantage of. And it's awesome to hear that you had so many opportunities to cover different kinds of sports and really hone in your craft, like you said, just from getting rep after rep after rep. So that's a really cool story. I want to then move over to now, like you said, after your sophomore year, it's 2017. You decided to come back to the DC area and work for the Bethesda Big Train. I want to ask you first, before we get into the actual season itself, what kind of put you onto the Bethesda Big Train when you were looking to apply for summer internships?
So it's funny. I didn't really know how to approach summer internships. I had emailed a bunch of people all over the place. I kind of did the cliche thing of where I looked up every paper I could find and emailed the sports editor and said, here's what I've done. And, I'd love to work for you. Now, granted, most of the stuff I sent them probably wasn't, up to my standards now. So it's funny looking back on some of the clips and stuff I sent. But, my mom actually mentioned something. I guess we had gone to some Big Train games as kids. I was aware of what the Big Train was, at least growing up in the DMV for 15 years. And so she said, she was like, oh, like, what about the Big Train? I wonder if they have interns. I said, sure. What the heck? Let's try it. I'll apply. And, GM at the time, David Snyder, gave me a call. I interviewed for it and got the position. It was awesome. It was really, like I said, kind of a random coincidence, but, was really happy to have the opportunity from David and Chris Rogers, who's the GM now. Was my superior at the time, I suppose. But Chris and I have become really good friends and have stayed really tight. And since I was in Bethesda, and like I said, it was definitely a super random connection to getting to Big Train, but it was a really awesome place and just a really, really great place for me to grow as a young writer, and a lot of really great opportunity as well.
That's incredible. And it was a great team that you ended up covering too. I mean, this team ended up finishing, like I said, the 4th ranked team in the country. They ended up winning the Cal Ripken League Championship. And there were a lot of studs on this team. I mean, you look at Logan Driscoll, Ty Madrigal, you have James Outman, who ended up winning Player of the Year and was named a perfect game first team All-American. So as a writer for the team, I mean, you clearly knew more about the team than most people did that summer. What do you remember most about covering that 2017 Big Train squad?
Well, one of the funniest moments, or I guess things from that whole year, was at the time, Tanner Allen, who's now going to be a junior, I guess would be a senior with all the eligibility things going on now at Mississippi State, where I cover now, was coming out of his senior year of high school and had committed to Mississippi State and was getting ready to play his freshman year at Mississippi State, was on that Big Train team as well. And I remember coming down to Starkville when I first got here and walked into a press conference, and, I had forgotten to text Tanner and tell him that I was moving down here, and, saw him, and he kind of looked at me. He's like, what are you doing here? And it was a whole thing. So that was a funny Big Train connection now. But, that was a team that really, really had a lot of talent. I mean, that was a fun thing to kind of look through the, drafts of, the years after that in the last, two and a half years really, to see all the guys that came through that. I mean, James Outman was a guy that was really, really fun to watch. Vinny Esposito came back for a second summer, I believe, that year too, and he was great. Logan Driscoll was something to behold. I mean, he was a guy that you watched and you kind of knew that he was the kind of guy that could be a top 5 type round draft pick. Ty Madrigal as well. Obviously, his brother was a top 10 pick, a top 3 pick, I believe. And Ty was a similar type guy, competitor, really, really just untouchable. Steven Schock coming out of the bullpen. I mean, man, could he pitch? I mean, it's a little cliche, but like when Steven came out of the bullpen, I mean, you knew the game was over. It was like Mariano Rivera coming out of Yankee Stadium. And, I don't use that lightly, having grown up with a dad from New York, but, it was a team that was really talented, really deep, and just, it wasn't just one guy. I mean, they had, top to bottom 1 through 9 guys that could swing the bat. And I think that's, something that was so unique about this team, and a lot of really great starters on that team too. I mean, I think Sal Colangelo went, 5, 6 different starters that year. I mean, there were a lot of guys that could start games and get through 3, 4, 5 innings. And that was really fun to watch. I mean, obviously in summer ball, you don't want to exhaust your pitchers too much just because, it is for, scouting and for fun is a little bit, but, it was a team that really, really had a lot of talent. And, looking back on it and looking at, like I said, the drafts of past few years, it's pretty impressive to see where all the guys have ended up.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a star-studded team and a star-studded lineup, like you said. What was your favorite memory from that summer just covering the team? We had 2 games from that summer end up in our top 10 Thursday series this year, and I know you were able to speak on the show a little bit about those big games, but do you have any in particular memory from that season that really stands out to you?
I got to think. I think it was the Alexandria game that they came back big. I was actually out of town. I think I was had a family vacation or something along those lines. I forget, that had been previously scheduled, but I really do remember the championship game. Ty pitched I think Ty had pitched earlier in the week, so he came out and pitched maybe 1 inning. Tyler Smith was the starting pitcher that night, if I remember correctly, out of East Carolina, and he was a guy that had generally gotten through about 2-3 innings really well, but it was around inning 3 or 4 that he ran into some trouble. Tyler ended up going, I think, 5, maybe 6 innings that night, and I think gave up 1 hit, maybe 2 hits by the time he got pulled. I mean, he had as good a night as he had all year. Ty came out and pitched an inning. I think there was someone else in between that bridged the gap, and then Shock pitched 2 innings, if I have my memory serves me right. And, I remember everyone kind of standing up and cheering and, let's go Big Train and all that. That kind of goes into it going into the last out. And, Shock struck out the side. I think he struck out the side in the 9th inning. The last pitch, I think it was like a cutter on the inside corner, got a guy swinging and, kind of threw up a whole celebration on the mound, sort of yelled, and everyone went crazy. And it was really cool. It was one of those moments that you could feel the tenseness of it. And I know that's probably a little cliche, but it was really cool. I mean, it was really fun to watch. And, that game was pretty wild. Like I said, I mean, it was a heck of a game from the pitching staff, and, really, really impressive game from the pitching staff. I think there were a couple big hits from, was it Maryland Zach Jankarski, and Vinny Esposito, I think, had a home run in the 8th or 9th inning as well, to kind of give the Big Train a little bit of a cushion. But it was excuse me, it was a heck of a game. It was really, really fun, and I definitely remember that distinctly.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a fantastic game. And as somebody who has to cover an incredible championship game of my own, I definitely know what you're talking about when you say just how crazy the tension can get in those late game situations with the championship on the line. So that's awesome. I need to ask, what did you learn or really take away as a writer and as a sports journalist from your experience in Bethesda? Because obviously at the end of the day, it's also a learning experience in addition to just being a whole lot of fun.
Definitely. I think one of the biggest things that I learned is just to be, I don't want to say self-motivated because I don't mean it like that, but be on top and be thinking of story ideas all the time. David and Chris gave me a lot of guidance and help, but also basically said, whatever you want to do, it's up, like, you can do it. And, if you want to pitch something and do it, go for it. If you want to sit down with a player before the game for, 20, 30 minutes, whatever you want to do, go for it. We can do that. So, I think that one of the things that I, at least at the time and still do, really enjoy doing is, writing some longer features. And I got to do a good bit of that at Big Train on, I think, Tanner Allen at one point, and a couple other players, Gabby Cruz, who was from Miami and had, I think his parents were Cuban immigrants, and, he talked a lot about that. And, he and I sat down in the pavilion at Shirley Povich and sat and talked for about 30, 45 minutes before a game one day. So, stuff like that was really great because, first of all, I was given the opportunity to do it, and that was the biggest thing. But at the same time, it really taught me to, go look for unique things, pitch things, try and find stories about these guys that, kind of went beyond the baseball field. The story I read about Tanner was one of my favorite stories that summer. Tanner was was like a triple option high school quarterback, and, was as good basically on the football field as he was on the baseball field. And, I know that a lot of what he, does and sort of his work ethic that is, he has in baseball is rooted in his football. And I talked to his high school coaches and some others and him as well. And, it was really interesting to see and talk to, just because I think, stories like that, we see a lot of them, but I think they're really interesting. And I think it's always interesting to take guys, away from the diamond a little bit, or just, sort of dig into stuff like that. And, having been afforded the opportunity to do that by Chris and David and everyone else involved with Big Train was really awesome. I loved it. And definitely, I think the hardest thing was definitely learning how to run the music and do a point streak and all that. But I think I'm still a little bit emotionally scarred from having to do point streak. But for those who don't know the scoring system, that's a little finicky. I don't know if it's gotten better since I left, but
no, it hasn't.
That's good to know. But man, it was that was probably about the hardest part. But the writing itself was great, and like I said, I was afforded a lot of opportunity.
I'm happy that you bring up just some of the struggles and nuances of having to work as a media person for the Big Train, because you're not just writing. I mean, you're also working the score. You're also working the music some days. So it's a whole operation going on up there in the booth and the press box for Big Train games at Shirley Povich Field. So I'm happy that you mentioned that as well. Well, clearly you took a lot from Big Train and were able to make the most out of your clips that you garnered not only that summer, but also at your time at Indiana the following school year, because you then got a great opportunity to come back to DC the very next summer and work for the Sports Capital, a sports site that covered all professional and college sports in the DMV. And you got there at the perfect time, because 2018 was, I still say this, one of the best years in DC sports history, in that you had the Washington Capitals make their first Stanley Cup run in 20 years and end up winning their first championship as a franchise. And then you also had, just a month later, the 2018 MLB AllStar Game played at Nationals Park. So you had a lot of big events that you had the chance to cover. What was that experience like? We'll start with the Capitals, getting a chance to cover a team going on a championship run.
Yeah, so the Sports Capital was really cool, and I guess for some context, that was before The Athletic had a DC site at that point, and the site basically did a lot of what The Athletic does. It was a lot of feature stuff, a lot of sort of unique coverage and things like that. And the guys I worked with, Brian McNally and Todd Divas and Ben Standig are all awesome guys still in the DC area and covering teams around there too. So shout out to them, big fans. But they, the thing is that they really pushed me to do creative stuff, and especially with the Capitals. When they're running to the Stanley Cup, I got to DC probably around, I think they had just finished the first or second round. So it was it was toward the tail end of that. I got to DC sort of early May. So a little bit of the playoffs had passed, or the playoffs had maybe just started. That said, covering the Lightning series, covering the Stanley Cup itself as well. I didn't cover any home games. Getting credentials was kind of a whole process, but, I was at every press conference. I was at Kettler Iceplex every day, pretty much, in the locker room, talking to guys. And I think, it's really something that I hadn't really experienced, and I did a lot of it with the Nationals as well. But, as a writer, especially on a professional beat and covering those kinds of teams, like, you got to learn to work a locker room. And, it can be a very uncomfortable setting, I would say. It's definitely a weird situation where you've got a lot of media members milling around, and sometimes there's players there and most of them don't want to talk to you. So it's it's definitely a unique situation being in that. But, the Caps were awesome. Those guys were really, really great with the media. Barry Trotz was great with the media at podium stuff. Brian McClellan, the GM as well. The guys in the locker room, Joel Ward, TJ Oshie, Tom Wilson. Those guys were all really, really good to me, especially as a young writer. Sort of bared with me and, were helpful, and were really, really nice guys to deal with and good guys to cover. I didn't really ever think I'd be covering a Stanley Cup final, and given all the heartbreak that DC fans have endured in recent years, it was something. I was at the Capital One arena for the final game. What was that? Game 5 against Vegas. And my job was to just report on what I was seeing. The job was like, whatever you're seeing, write about it. And that was really cool. It was really cool, an open-ended thing. So, I got to the stadium probably 4 hours before the game and basically just hung out in the streets and was talking to people and stuff. And then, the Mystics played a game that night at the arena and had a watch party afterwards. So anyone who bought tickets to the Mystics game could stay and for the watch party. So it was a whole thing. Talked to people in between periods, and then ultimately went out into the streets afterwards and talked to people. And, the image of, everyone out on the portrait gallery steps. I remember, that image is pretty much seared into my brain. My kind of mediocre iPhone photo of it anyway, but it was really something. I remember talking to a guy before the game who his wife and him had constructed a life-size replica of the Stanley Cup, and he was holding it on the steps. And, it was just people like that were really, really cool to cover. And, there was a real energy around the city. I always joked that running around the streets that night, I told my parents, I think that was about as close to being a combat reporter as I ever needed to be, because we're throwing elbows, trying to get through people and everything. But man, it was wild. You had people climbing fence poles and up on top of, rooftops and everything. It was insane. I've never seen anything like it. And it was, it was really cool, both, as someone who grew up watching the Caps and, grew up with the Ovechkin Capitals, frankly, and then just as a reporter too, just to, the idea, that we always get taught in school is, you're there to document history, and getting to be there to be a part of that was really something.
Well, as somebody who was there in a non-professional role, yeah, I can definitely attest to just the pandemonium on the outside. I was pretty bummed I couldn't get into the Capital One Arena for that watch party. Tickets went like that. People were selling Mystics tickets at $1,000 a pop just to try to sit in the arena for a game that was almost 1,000 miles away in Las Vegas. And it was just pandemonium. One of the greatest memories I have personally as a sports fan. And like you said, it's memories that are just seared into my brain and will most likely never go. Well, for people who are not sports journalists and, they're fans first and fans only for the most part, how difficult is it, especially in that situation, to where you are covering a team and, perhaps even just a player like Alex Ovechkin that you grew up loving, you grew up watching every single game and rooting for that team, and now you're in the same room with Alex Ovechkin, one of the greatest goal scorers in the history of hockey, and you have to stay composed, you have to stay professional. For somebody who isn't familiar with sports journalism and just being professional in that environment, what would you say were some of the challenges of that?
Yeah, I think so. I got lucky in that after my sophomore year and coming back from Big Train, I guess it was the spring before I went to Big Train, I started covering Indiana football for the Fort Wayne paper. And I did that for about 2.5 years then through the end of my time at Indiana. And, that was sort of the first part of it where I, got to, cover these athletes that I watched on Saturdays, at least my first 2 years at Indiana. That I really was fans of. And, it takes time. That's something that's hard for any young reporter. You definitely have to learn that there's a line to be drawn, and that when you're doing the job, you're doing the job. You're not there to be a fan. And that helped. Now, that said, when you're walking into a locker room with, Alex Ovechkin or Bryce Harper over at Nationals Park or whatever, it's definitely a little different. But, the reality is I think that internally you can flip a switch. And I felt very strongly that, I've been able to do that. I never went in there. I tried to go in there with as, free as few preconceived notions as I could. You know, now it's a little easier because I'm covering a team in a school that I don't really have any connection to. But, you know, covering a team like the Caps, like, you know, I grew up with the Washington Capitals and grew up with the Alex Ovechkin Capitals. So it's definitely a little, you definitely get a little awestruck the first time you walk in there. You know, I remember seeing Alex Ovechkin on one side and Tom Wilson and TJ Oshie and whoever else. And, you know, the thing that I think gets lost sometimes, and, you know, as reporters, you see it more and more, but, you know, as fans, it's really easy to forget, is like, these guys are normal people as well. I mean, yes, they play sports and there's a lot that goes into that and a lot of fame and cameras and lights and whatever. And, you know, for better or worse, I guess I'm probably part of that. But, you know, these guys are people too. I mean, Tom Wilson's a guy that, you know, has the rap that he does on the ice and, you know, is definitely an enforcer on the ice and is fun to watch. But, you know, when I got in the locker room, Tom was always a guy that I could go to and was willing to stay, you know, an extra 5-10 minutes if I needed to ask him a couple of questions, or, you know, me at whatever it was, 20, 21 years old at the time, was, you know, willing to give me the time. And, you know, stuff like that you appreciate. You know, you also have to realize, like, you're there as a reporter. It's a professional setting. There's lots of other professional reporters around you. And I think that helps in that the fact that you've got kind of veteran people around to kind of look to and see what they're doing. And that was really cool. And getting to meet just some of the people in the DC, you know, media landscape was really cool in that vein. But, you know, like I said, you know, these guys are real people. And at the end of the day, the fact that you can sit down, that they're willing to sit down and talk to you, and, you know, they don't have to do that. And, you know, you know, for me, as soon as I kind of realized, like, okay, like, you know, these guys have a million other places or other things that they probably want to be doing than talking to some 20-year-old kid with a microphone stuck in their face. But, you know, the fact that these guys are willing to do that was really cool. And I think at that point, it brings back some of those layers. And I think that helped. And, you know, for me, you know, I tried to be as objective as I possibly could. You know, if the Caps did something poorly, I was going to write it that they did something poorly. If they did something great, I was going to write it. But, you know, good, bad, and different, you know, that's kind of the job. You can't, you know, pick and choose which parts you write and which parts you don't. I mean, you know, you have to be as unbiased and objective as you can. And I definitely tried to do that as much as I could.
I appreciate you sharing that, because, you know, there's always the people on the outside who aren't really familiar with what goes into a job like this. And, you know, they ask, well, can you get an autograph or this, that, and the other? And it's just like, well, no, not really, because that's, you know, again, you're there for work and they're there for work. So you want to make sure you maintain that level of professionalism. And I'm also happy to hear that you really use that as a learning experience, because, I mean, if you can get to a point to where you are looking at Alex Ovechkin as just a normal human being and not this mega superstar that's known across the entire globe as one of the best hockey players in, you know, the NHL, you can do the same when you go back to Indiana and look at these guys who play on Saturdays or are on the swim and dive team as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it's, you know, it's like you were saying, like, one of the questions I get all the time is, oh, you cover the team, so do you, like, travel with the team, or do you get free tickets or what? And it's like, no, I'm not affiliated with them. I just cover them. It's a difference, and there's a line there. But yeah, no, I agree. I think that's the biggest thing, you know, from, you know, for me, I went from, you know, swimming and diving to Big Train to the sports capital and covering all that. And I got back to Indiana, and it was the football team. I covered the men's basketball team in the spring of my senior year as well, or winter, spring, whatever it was, and all that. And I mean, those guys matter. Those guys are a big deal. And, you know, having had that experience in DC and was really great for me, because I think it really taught me a lot about that. Now, that said, that does not mean that I still don't go into interviews like marginally nervous or, you know, anything like that. You know, here at Mississippi State, we've got Mike Leach all the time. And, you know, the first couple of times we had Mike, you know, it was definitely a little, I don't want to say unsettling, because that's not the right word, but it's definitely a little interesting. You're like, oh, this is, you know, the guy that everyone in America loves to see, and the, you know, the coach that's going to say whatever he wants. And there's something to that. And it doesn't change that there's definitely a, you know, subtle nervousness about it. And, you know, I don't think I'm alone in that. I think there's a lot of people older than I that would probably, and more experienced than I, that would probably say the same thing. So yeah, so I mean, it doesn't necessarily always go away in that sense, but, you know, you definitely learn to sort of deal with it and understand it and sort of ride that line.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll definitely get into your Mississippi State job in just a little bit, but I want to backtrack just one more time, just back to 2018, and ask you to kind of give us some details about your experience covering the MLB AllStar Game, because you're going from one summer covering the Cal Ripken League of guys who are aspiring to hopefully one day hear their name called in the MLB draft, to now a year later, you're talking to guys who have heard their names called, reached the pinnacle of the sport, and are now in the summer classic in the most powerful city in America. Not to mention, like you mentioned earlier, Bryce Harper is playing at home. He had just come off of a home run derby win, one of the few guys to win the home run derby in their home ballpark. Max Scherzer is starting that game, so there's a lot of buzz around not only the game itself, but also the Nationals. I had the pleasure of getting a chance to go there and watch the game, and it really is kind of almost like a holiday for baseball fans. I mean, as at that point, I had never met a Seattle Mariners fan before. And so to see people from all across the country rooting for every team was a real interesting experience and a really cool experience to be a part of. And I'm sure for you covering it, seeing all of these different players from across the MLB come together must have been really interesting for you to get a chance to cover.
Yeah, definitely. And honestly, even before the All-Star game, one of my favorite things was going to the prospect game and the home run derby as well. Obviously, there was a lot that went on with that with Bryce. And, my assignment was actually to cover the home run derby and write whatever happened with Bryce. So the fact that he won made it, a great story, but was really interesting. But, one of my favorite moments from that was, so I had just come back before that summer. I just spent a semester in Spain, living in the south of Spain and studying and all. And I got there, and and I won't pretend that I'm fluent in Spanish, but I guess I can get by. And I guess I speak enough to get by, and it's pretty good. But I was in the locker room, and I was talking. The Nats had one prospect in the game, and there was me, and I think it was someone from Masson maybe or something along those lines. And we were the only guys talking to this Nationals guy. I think everyone else had kind of cleared out. And, his English wasn't great. It was kind of in and out, and, definitely couldn't quite get the same kind of depth that you can sometimes get with guys. But, I kind of let everyone ask their questions, and then I asked him a question in Spanish, and he kind of looked at me, and he was like, what? He was like, you speak Spanish? Like, yeah. So I said, yeah, is that more comfortable for you? And he said, yeah, definitely. So we started talking, and, the reporter next to me, we were the only two people there at the time. And he kind of looked at me, he's like, can you just translate for me? I was like, I'll try. I'll give it a go. So, I don't mean that as a humble brag or anything, but it was definitely a really unique experience. And the first time I had ever used that or had to do that. And, in a baseball locker room, it's a really diverse place. And, I ended up, later that day having a conversation with, I sat down with David Ortiz for a few minutes. He was coaching one of the prospect teams as well. And, had talked to him in Spanish a little bit as well. And that was really cool too. So, it was one of those things that for me as a young reporter, first of all, it was a cool thing to be able to use. And, I really liked being able to speak Spanish when I could, but also it was just a really cool thing to see because it's a really, really diverse group. And especially in Major League Baseball, it's a really diverse sport. So, being able to see that and take that in was really cool. But, as for the actual All-Star game, it's a spectacle. And, as reporters, events like that can be really hard because the access is a little bit crazy. There's 5,000 media members everywhere, and it seems like there's more and more every year. And it's definitely hard to find, unique angles and that kind of thing. So, for me, frankly, I was just happy to be there and be in the press box as an intern. And I was probably, one of my bosses joked that night, he's like, honestly, you're probably one of the only interns in the entire city in this press box right now. I was like, yeah, you're right. I'm not going to complain by any stretch. So that was really cool. But no, it's definitely a challenge, and that's the hardest part about games like that. You do get some sessions with the guys where they're at their podium, but they do definitely, especially the Nationals guys, they recognize their local media people. I remember when Bryce was doing his podium session, and, they basically have all the NL guys, all the AL guys, and they're all at podiums, and you go in sessions. And I remember when Bryce was doing his, and Bryce and I didn't have a great, a long-standing relationship or anything like that. It was only for a few months, but, this was probably 2-3 months into it at that point. And so I had talked to Bryce enough times, and, I went up there and, after a few of the other people had cleared out, he and I just kind of sat there and joked about a few things and talked for a few minutes and just, shot it. So that was fun. And that's really cool. And, that it was really an opening just to see that, how you can build relationships with these guys as a reporter and, what that's like. And, covering an All-Star game was really, really cool though. You got media members from, as far as I think there were someone told me they had media members from like Korea and Japan. You had people from all over the U.S. You had some people from there were a couple of guys, like radio guys from the Dominican. I mean, it's a really interesting dynamic, and especially at something like an MLB AllStar Game. I mean, like I said, it's such a diverse group of people, and the media sort of climate of it reflected that.
Wow, yeah, I mean, getting a chance to just chop it up with Bryce Harper certainly doesn't sound like a bad time at all. That's incredible. I mean, that again, and I think relationships are such an important part of the job, because if you can get to know the athlete and the athlete can trust you and know that you'll tell his story in a fair light, then he'll provide more to you. And I think it's really cool, especially to hear that you had that kind of interaction with one of the biggest stars in the sport. And, I mean, that's a crucial experience, I can imagine, for you to have at such a young age, to just have an opportunity to really learn how to not bond with these guys, but like you said, build a relationship and be able to kind of earn their trust a little bit moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. And that's the thing that I think, kind of like I said before, like it's things like that and experiences like that, even if that was for 3-5 minutes, he and I just talked, like in the grand scheme, Bryce probably still has no idea who I am. But at the same time, like it was still a really, just sort of like a refreshing thing to remind yourself that, Bryce is one of the biggest superstars on the planet, but also, he's a human being and can sit there and, shoot the crap for a few minutes. Like it's stuff like that as a reporter is really cool. And especially as a young one, I mean, it was, 21 years old at the time. I mean, it was really, really good for me and just really good to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine. Well, let's move on now to where you are today, and that is graduation at Indiana. You were able to land a job at the Commercial Dispatch in Starksville, Mississippi, covering Mississippi State athletics. You've been covering the Bulldogs now since early 2019 in March, and this is now over a year. I'm sure, granted, in March this year, you didn't expect things to go the way they did, and hopefully things are now going back to normal with the SEC playing football and college basketball just down the line with an expected date of return not too far away. But I want to start this chapter of your career with an interesting story that I learned, and that is that you got the job at this place in Starksville, Mississippi, and then you decided or you found out, okay, well, the Commercial Dispatch is sending me to San Jose to go cover the NCAA tournament. So before you could even unpack everything in your new place in Starksville, Mississippi, you're now heading to the opposite side of the country in California to go cover a game between Liberty and Mississippi State. How was that experience? Because that's definitely got to be an interesting transition for your first job.
No, that's a great question. That's a good story, actually. But yeah, so I got back. I finished school finished classes in the fall of 18. And I stuck around Bloomington. I was covering the basketball team. So I had finished the semester early, but had basically finished in the sense that if I could land a job, I could go take it. And luckily I did that. So I get back. It's probably the middle of March. It's, right as tournament time's coming around. And, my first start day, I get there on Monday. I think my first actual start day was Tuesday. And on Wednesday, I was on a plane to San Jose. So I'm not kidding when I say that literally all of my belongings were in my car parked in front of the airport in Mississippi. So I was like, man, I'm going to get back and none of my stuff's going to be there. So that's going to be great. But yeah, so I spent the week in San Jose. I think I was there for about a week and a half. Mississippi State loses to Liberty, but I stayed for a couple extra days to do some extra reporting. One of the Liberty assistant coaches, his twin brother actually was an assistant coach at Mississippi State. So I got a few other extra stories out of it, and things like that. But coming back, I mean, it was, I finished the first week and people asked, how was Mississippi? How's it been so far? And I'm like, well, I've spent more time in California than I have in Mississippi. So other than that, it's great. But yeah, it was definitely a little wild. Frankly, that was the first NCAA basketball tournament that I'd covered. I mean, I'd covered big football games, covered Indiana basketball all year that year, but that was the first NCAA tournament basketball game that I'd covered. So that was definitely unique. San Jose was a really cool spot. It was definitely an interesting spot because you didn't necessarily have the 1 seeds and 2 seeds or anything like that. I mean, you had Mississippi State was a 5, I believe, that year. Virginia Tech was the 4 seed that year. And then you had was it Cal Poly or Long Beach State maybe. Or UC Davis, that's what it was. Sorry, I'm running through all the California schools. and Liberty and a few others. So it was a little bit of a smaller site, which was actually great for me. It wasn't quite as crowded media wise. But I didn't know anyone. I didn't know any of the guys on the beat. It was definitely a weird experience. Just kind of, wandered the city a little bit, got to know it a little bit, got some In-N-Out burger for the first time. So that was exciting, but it was a pretty wild experience. I'm not going to lie, getting there and, without even dropping my belongings, being able to fly out there and get there. And frankly, I didn't even move into my apartment here in Starkville till I think about 3 weeks later. So I was living out of a hotel for a few weeks before I got settled and could actually get into my apartment. So it was the first month on the job was pretty wild.
That's crazy. And I mean, it's not like unfortunately, I'm sure you would have loved to have continued to follow the team had they gone deeper in the tournament, but it's not like you're going to a game to where, Mississippi State just routs this small school Liberty in the first round. This is a huge upset. It's a 12 versus a 5, which, I mean, granted, it feels like we see that almost every year, but it happened to be the game that you're covering. And yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's a part of you that feels like I just flew all the way out to California to watch Liberty beat Mississippi State in the first game. What was that experience like? And what was it like? I mean, like you said, not knowing really many guys on the beat, and now you have to talk to them post game after a loss like that.
Yeah, it was definitely tough. I remember, the biggest thing that I've learned and that I've always been taught in school and from mentors and whoever else, is just be empathetic and have empathy for people in situations like that, whether it's, that or you're talking to someone about a lost relative or things like that. Like, you just got to have some empathy and some sympathy for people. And I think I was very careful to toe that line when, going in the locker room after that. The thought definitely crossed my mind, well, crap, I flew 1,000 miles to watch Mississippi State lose the one game they're going to play now, and now I'm here for another 4 days, but such is life. So that said, walking in the locker room, I hadn't done anything with the basketball team at that point. They hadn't even the press conference that they had before they went to San Jose had happened, I think, before I even got there. So I get there and I'm talking to the guys and I said, hey, like, I'm new. I feel bad. I'm sorry I haven't, covered y'all all year. And I hate that I have to ask you about, like, the worst loss of your career and a game that was, this tight. I think Liberty ended up winning by like 5 or 6 points. So, but you could tell that they were going to win the game with probably a minute and a half left. But that said, like I said, just trying to have empathy and, guys were sympathetic to it. And I appreciated that, Quindary Weatherspoon is now with the Spurs and Eric Holman, who was with the Clippers G League squad. And I think is still in the G League for a little bit now. There were some really talented guys on that team and it was nice because they definitely had some senior leadership and some senior guys on that team that were willing to, take the time and talk. And that was really great. And I appreciated that because, like I said, that was a really hard time for them and to be opening up about something like that. So, being able to talk to them was really great and they were really, really good about it.
Well, after you now come back to Mississippi, you now have to move into a new place. This is your home now. You're now working, covering the SEC. First of all, what were some of the challenges of landing your first job in a town that you have never been before, in a state that you've probably never visited? And then how have you kind of learned from your experiences now in your first job, and how has that helped you kind of pursue, or rather help build your career getting to where you are right now here in 2020?
Yeah, it's really funny. I look back and, notwithstanding the fact that 2020 has felt like it's been 10 years, it kind of feels like it's been, a lot longer than just over a year and a half or going on 2 years now since I moved here. But, I've definitely grown a lot. I've developed a lot. I've learned a lot. Moving here at first, I was definitely a little nervous. I definitely had like a really good group of friends in college and in high school and all that. I was definitely nervous about moving somewhere I didn't know anyone. I like to think that I'm a pretty out there and social person. So I wasn't super worried, but definitely was a little concerned, like, oh, who am I going to hang out with? Or, who am I going to go be able to get a beer with on a Friday night? But, things have gone well and it's been a really great group. The guys that I cover the team with are really great. It's a really, pretty tight-knit group, which is really fun. And I think that's something I've learned a little bit more. And I learned some at Indiana too, just being around the pros on the beat as well. The people who cover the teams day to day are generally, at least it seems, and in my experience anyway, have been pretty close. And it's nice to be able to hang out and, when you're on the road, go for drinks and restaurants and dinners and things like that with guys that you work with day to day, even if you're at different outlets. But that said, Mississippi is very different than Chicago or Washington, D.C. I've got family that lives in the South and Kentucky, North Carolina, Virginia, and, so I've spent a lot of time in that region of the country, but not Mississippi. My mom's from Florida, and, my grandparents are from New Orleans. So I've got some of that in my family, but it was definitely unique. It's definitely a different culture. SEC football is a whole thing. And, I'm not going to sit here and plug the, SEC, it just means more thing, but there's definitely a layer. It's cliche, but there's a layer of truth to it. I mean, people care about it. You don't necessarily have the same level of pro teams here. So people, gravitate toward their SEC teams. And there's something really interesting and I think really, really cool about that. But it's definitely a different culture, different place. But, I've really loved it. People have been really good to me. And like I said, I've learned a lot, really learned how to, be a pro and, go about your business and look for unique stories and things like that. And, write what no one else is writing and that kind of thing. Learn how to, develop sources and get to know people in the athletic department and that kind of thing. And I'm by no means an expert in that. And it's something I'm still learning a lot and have a ton to learn, but it's been really, really cool. And like I said, it's hard to believe I'm going on 2 years now.
Well, Ben, we're excited to follow your stories going forward this fall now as SEC football is back and full swing, and we're excited to watch your coverage of the Bulldogs this season and hopefully towards a national championship. So, Ben, thank you so much for talking to us today. It's always a pleasure to get a chance to talk with somebody who has been through the organization and really seen success afterwards and made the most of their opportunity with the Bethesda Big Train. So as somebody who is also a media intern, I definitely appreciate you spending your time with me. And thank you so much for taking your time and really giving us some insight on how you have built your career in sports journalism.
Yeah, happy to do it. Always happy to help the Big Train and love doing it and love my time in Bethesda. So for me, it's fun and happy to do it.
Well, that's going to do it for our third episode of Train Talks here on Big Train TV. Thank you again to Ben for joining us. For everything else you want Big Train related, keep it right here on Big Train TV. We'll see you next time.